Chuck Hirchert. The book I'm reading is The Ugly American. I'll just read the preface, so to speak. The multi-million copy bestseller whose title became a synonym for What is Wrong with American Foreign Policy by William Lederer and Eugene Burdick. And it's talk about censorship history a little bit. In 1953, Senator Joel McCarthy led an investigation of the Overseas Library Program. The library is overseen by the International Information Agency, IIA, existed with the objective of providing a balanced view of U.S. beliefs to people in foreign countries. Books were chosen based on content without regard to authorship. Controversial books were included, while blatantly anti-American or pro-communist books were excluded from the library shelves. McCarthy and his team planned to investigate the way in which controversial books were allowed to reach the libraries. And immediately after publication in 1958, The Ugly American was temporarily censored by George V. Allen, director of the U.S. Information Agency, previously the IIA. Allen, undoubtedly influenced by McCarthy's investigation 5 years earlier, felt that permitting the book to be sent abroad under this program would not be in the interests of the United States. In December of 1958, Allen changed his mind. An agency spokesman said one facet of Mr. Allen's decision to approve the book for the program was his desire not to create any impression of another Pasternak case by censorship at home. He was referring to the Soviet Union's ban on Dr. Zhivago by Boris Pasternak. It's an interesting book. I'm going to read a little. The last chapter is a factual epilogue, and I'd like to read a few parts of that. It's not orthodox to append a factual epilogue to a work of fiction. However, we would not wish any reader to put down our book thinking that what he has read is wholly imaginary, for it is not. It is based on fact. It is our purpose here to give our reasons and our sources. Although the characters are indeed imaginary, and Sarkin is fiction, each of the small and sometimes tragic events we have described has happened many times. Too many times. We believe that if such things continue to happen, they will multiply into a pattern of disaster. It is easy in a time of great events, of Sputniks and explorers and ICBMs and dirty and clean atomic weapons, to overlook one of the hard facts of history. A nation may lose its power and integrity slowly in minute particles. We believe that a nuclear cataclysm is unlikely, but that our free life may well be lost in a succession of bits and fragments. The authors have taken part in the events in Southeast Asia which have inspired this book, and in both the records and in the field we have studied the communist way to power. As writers, we have sought to dramatize what we have seen of the Americans who represent this struggle. And the last part of the factual epilogue is here. We do not need a horde of 1,500,000 Americans, mostly amateurs, who are now working in the United States overseas. What we need is a small force of well-trained, well-chosen, hardworking, and dedicated professionals. They must be willing to risk their comforts in some lands, and in some lands, their health. They must go equipped to apply a positive policy promulgated by a clear-thinking government. They must speak the language of the land of their assignment, and they must be more expert in its problems than are the natives. We have been offering the Asian nations the wrong kind of help. We have lost sight of our own past, and that we are trying to sell guns and money alone, instead of remembering that it is the quest for the dignity of freedom that was responsible for our own way of life. All over Asia, we have found that the basic American ethic is revered and honored and imitated when possible. We must, while helping Asia towards self-sufficiency, show by example that America is still the America of freedom and hope and knowledge and law. If we succeed, we cannot lose the struggle. There's a lot of wonderful characters in the book, but the one I particularly want to emphasize is it's the chapter is The Ugly American, and he's really a pretty good American, but he's showing some ugly sides of the other parts. "Damn it," said Homer Atkins to himself as he looked around the room at the fashionably dressed men The princes of bureaucracy were the same all over the world. They sat in their freshly pressed clothes, ran their clean fingers over their smooth cheeks, smiled knowingly at one another, and asked engineers like Atkins silly questions. What Homer wanted to say was, listen, you damn fools, it's a simple problem. Let us engineers solve it and come back with what we've been able to do. And if you don't like what we've done, throw me out of the country. But don't bring up these goddamn silly questions about politics and native psychology. But Atkins didn't say it. He didn't even swear, which was unusual for him. He looked at his hands. This was a trick he had learned long ago. His hands always reminded him that he was an ugly man. Somehow his thoughts always made him pause, which in turn gave him time to prepare his next step. He had often used the technique during World War II when he was dealing with high government officials or with corporation executives who wanted the products of his firm. Atkins stared at his hands as if they belonged to a stranger. His hands were laced with prominent veins and spotted with big liverish freckles. His fingernails were black with grease. His palms bore tiny nicks and scars of a lifetime of practical engineering. The palms of his hands were calloused. Homer Atkins was worth $3 million, every dime of which he had earned by his own efforts, but he was most proud and confident of his ugly hands. Atkins knew that he could always make a living with them. Atkins was aware of the fact that he was the only man in the room not wearing a tie. In fact, he was wearing a rough khaki shirt, khaki pants, and an old Marine field boots. He still had the smell of the jungle about him. The other men, Vietnam, French, or American, all smelled of aftershave lotion. Homer heaved a slow sigh and lifted his head. All right, gentlemen, I'm going to say it once more, Atkins said. The United States may ask me to come out here and give you some advice on building dams and military roads. You know what I am. I'm a heavy construction man. Earth moving, concrete, road building, and that sort of thing. Now, I've been here for 10 months, and I've walked all over this damn country from Pan Rang to Van Gee and then back into the hills of Kontum. I've talked to 1,000 people. I've surveyed dams and routes for military hardtop roads and airstrips. A slender Vietnamese interrupted. He spoke English with a French accent, and Atkins supposed that he'd been educated at the Sorbonne. Even with the accent, his English was better than Atkins. Mr. Atkins, we are very grateful for you to come here to help us, the Vietnamese said gently. Your government has been generous. You have been generous, and now we would like your recommendations as where the roads and dams should be built. I went all over that in the report, Atkins said. Didn't you read it? Yes, Mr. Atkins, we all read it, a middle-aged Frenchman said. But it didn't tell us where the roads and dams should go. Because you don't need dams and roads, Atkins said. Maybe later, but right now you need to concentrate on first things, largely things that your own people can manufacture and use. I don't know much about farming or city planning or that kind of thing, but I can tell you that your people need other things besides military roads. You ever hear of a food shortage being solved by someone building a military highway designed to carry tanks and trucks? Mr. Atkins, I think the decision about whether we need dams and highways is a political decision, which we must make for ourselves, the Vietnamese said, after whispering rapidly to the Frenchman. Do I gather that you do not intend to recommend the building of any dams or highways in Vietnam? Atkins knew the Vietnamese was trying to scare him, and he felt only a dull anger. He had spent his life making bids involving hundreds of millions of dollars and thousands of men and his reputation, and it taught him not to back down. Look, mister, I don't know how often you get out of the Saigon and into the countryside, but you better go take a look at things, Atkins answered evenly. Mr. Joshua Gordon, the representative of the American embassy, was beginning to redden, but Atkins didn't care. You want a big industry, he went on. You want big factories, you want big TVAs scattered all over the countryside? That all takes skilled workmen and mines and lots of money, and a whole lot of people who are production-minded. Of course, you've got good people out there in the boondocks, good hardworking people who are plenty savvy, but they don't want what you want yet. It takes time for that. That's why I recommended in my report you start small with little things. Then after you lick them, go on to the bigger things. Hell, we could build dams and roads for you, but you don't have the skill or capacity or the need for them now. Mr. Atkins, I think it's a political decision that goes beyond your providence. Joshua Gordon cut in quickly. Atkins knew Gordon wanted to get the meeting over with. Let's just let your report stand and we'll discuss it on a higher level. Okay. But have any of you birds been out in the boondocks? Atkins asked stubbornly. Don't give me the statistics. Don't tell me about national aspirations. Just answer me. Have you been out in the boondocks? The Frenchmen, the Vietnamese, the Americans all sat quietly in collective embarrassment. The hint of a sneer showed on the face of the tall Vietnamese, and Atkins was aware again, as he always was, when he caught that look on someone's face, of his own personal ugliness. A tall American stood up and begged, "Mr. Atkins, my name is Gilbert McWhite, and I'm a visitor here, not a participant. But I should like to know what you recommended in your report. Ambassador McWhite, I don't really think we should take the time of the other gentlemen to go over this again." Mr. Gordon said, caught between the antagonism of the French and the Vietnamese and his respect for McWhite. "It won't take long," Atkins cut in. "I told them first step was to start things the Vietnamese can do themselves. Then they can go to the big things as they pick up skills." "What kind of things should they start with?" McWhite asked. "First, like a brick factory. Cheap to start, easy to run, and to give them building materials. Second, stone quarries in the back hills. Plenty of good stone there, and it could be used for building." The Frenchman was red in the face. He spoke quickly to the tall Vietnamese and then stood up. "Mr. Atkins," he said in perfect English, "you may not know it, but a French firm has a concession to handle the production of building materials in this country. If everyone started forming brick and quarry companies, it would ruin our relationship." "That's your problem, not mine," said Atkins. "Third, someone ought to set up a model canning plant. The country people can catch fish and raise vegetables, but they spoil before they can be brought to town. Small, cheap canning plants in about 20 towns would do plenty to help out. Fourth, the coastal land from Quy Nam to Phan Rang is acid and won't grow anything. But right back of it, just over the hills, is a long strip of beautiful, rich land. Why not just run a little finger roads back through the jungle so the coastal people can get to the good land? It's cheap and it's easy. A couple of bulldozers could rip out the roads and that would be it." "Now listen, Mr. Atkins, we didn't bring you out here as an agricultural expert," Joshua Gordon said, his bureaucratic sense of responsibility offended. "We already have lots of agricultural experts here." "Well, tell them to get off their asses and in the boondocks then," Atkins said, but without anger. He was looking at McWhite. This was the first man who had listened to him in a long time. "Ambassador McWhite, I must insist that we terminate this meeting," Mr. Gordon said. "I'm aware of Mr. Atkins' great talents and his personal reputation in the States, but this is most improper. An engineering giving gratuitous advice on farming and on military requirements," the Frenchman added. "Look, Ambassador, I could tell you a lot more little things, but first I have to say to him," and Atkins pointed a finger at the Frenchman, "You've got lots of military experts around here. You've got American planes and tanks and guns. But let me tell you something that you don't know. Do you know that Ho Chi Minh and his communists built a secret road several feet wide from the Chinese border right through the jungle, the entire length of Vietnam, almost to Saigon? Damn right you don't know, but that's how he got supplies through Dien Bien Phu. And the next time he moves, he'll be using that road to run supplies down to Saigon." The Frenchmen were on their feet, and the Vietnamese were fluttering in the room like frightened birds. Two French colonels were shouting loudly, "It's impossible to build a road through the jungle. Impossible!" Atkins stood up, and there was a sudden silence. He said just one word, "Nuts," and then he left. And that's the end. I think it's probably enough. Very interesting book, well worth a read. Very, very interesting.